Greetings and welcome back to Room 303 in Freshman English. We now turn to the important story of Leslie Marmon Silko, The Man to Send Rain Clouds. I'm, however, with you on page 290 of your hymnals because once again, we're going to compare two literary works together. And the first of those will be Man to Send Rain Clouds, and then the second will be Naran's Old Man of the Temple, and we'll have more to say about that one in our ensuing lecture. However, let's begin at 2b quickly, and our observations here are to compare setting. Now, in our study of short fiction as freshmen in Freshman English, we have been commenting on the importance of setting. We talked about it with American history. We talked about it in our study of interlopers. But here now, for our next two texts, we're going to concentrate specifically on setting. Read with me on page 290. The setting of a story is the time and place in which it occurs. The time may include not only the historical period, but also a year or an hour. Place may mean the social, economic, or, this is huge for our text, write it down, cultural environment, not just the location. Cultural aspects of setting may be present in a variety of ways. Let's make sure these are in our notes. The values, beliefs, characters hold. Details daily life, such as characters' work, food, clothing. Types of language, this is huge, such as non-English words, slang that characters use. To build setting, a writer may include idioms or phrases whose meanings differ from those of the individual words. The themes and issues as well can be a part of the historical period. The importance of setting varies from story to story. Sometimes the setting is only a backdrop for the action. In such a story, the setting could change, but events would remain the same. However, in some stories, the setting may shape the characters and plot of a story. For example, cultural expectations may cause characters to take specific actions. Vivid, descriptive details that focus on setting often create the mood. Let's write that one down. Setting can have a lot to do with mood or emotional atmosphere in a story, and even hint at what may happen to characters as the story unfolds. Now you're going to have two stories here, The Man to Send Rain Clouds and Old Man of the Temple. And in both of them, I want you to be working to fill out this chart about place, time, culture, and the like. The other thing we want to jot down in 2b, and this is huge, has to do with cultural perspectives. Notice, an author may express a distinct point of view, an attitude toward the cultural setting of a story. That perspective may be positive, negative, mixed, neutral. For example, an author may show that certain cultural values limit or complicate characters' lives. As you read, consider whether the author expresses a particular point of view toward the culture reflected in each story. And this will be significant for both of the stories that we will be working with, especially as it relates to questions of death. Anthropologists have for a long time, who study cultures, pointed out that if you want to know something about a culture, ask about two things. One, what do they do when a child is born? Two, what do they do when someone dies? Whatever it is that they're doing in regards to both of those, highly significant, right? Here we'll be concentrating on what happens at the end of life, and more particularly the issues of death and funerals and the like. All right, let's turn now to our author, Leslie Marmon Silko. We'll meet these authors. Leslie Marmon Silko, born 1948, still alive. Storytelling, we're told, we're reading now on 291. Storytelling has always been an important part of Leslie Marmon Silko's life. Raised on the Laguna Pueblo Reservation in New Mexico, she grew up listening to tribal stories told by her great-great-grandmother and great-aunts. She has said that the oral tradition, let's write that down, it's huge, the oral tradition, storytelling, is a, quote, collective memory that depends upon the whole community, end quote. In her stories, novels, poems, Silko explores what life is like for Native Americans in today's world. Many of her works capture the contrast between traditional values and beliefs and elements of modern life. In other words, write this down. Silko is very interested in the tension, right, between traditional values of Native American culture and living in a postmodern world. With that in mind, now let's turn to, it's an interesting title, The Man to Send Rain Clouds. And like we've done with a number of our stories, we're going to ask at the end of the story, why did Leslie Marmon Silko decide to name this story this? Now in this story, I want us to continue to focus on, at 2b, issues of conflict. So write this down. Just to remind, we have different kinds of conflict: internal, character versus self; external, character versus another character; character versus nature; character versus some kind of society or idea. And when we finish with this story, I'm going to ask you, what do you see as being interesting about the conflict in this story? Obviously the setting is important, but again, remembering, it's the what is it, how does it work part. Okay, so we'll talk about the what is it setting, but it's the how does it work part at 2a. The themes, the messages that are played out that will be significant. All right, like we have said before, we now turn to read the story. Again, I will challenge you to follow along with the reading of the story. Conquer monkey mind. Try to improve your reading by following along with the text. And then when we're finished, we'll have some conversation about the implications of the text. Here we go. The Man to Send Rain Clouds.
The Man to Send Rain Clouds by Marmon Silko. They found him under a big cottonwood tree. His Levi jacket and pants were faded light blue so that he had been easy to bind. The big cottonwood tree stood apart from a small grove of winter bare cottonwoods which grew in the wide sandy arroyo. He had been dead for a day or more, and the sheep had wandered and scattered up and down the arroyo. Leon and his brother-in-law, Ken, gathered the sheep and left them in the pen at the sheep camp before they returned to the cottonwood tree. Leon waited under the tree while Ken drove the truck through the deep sand to the edge of the arroyo. He squinted up at the sun and unzipped his jacket. It sure was hot for this time of year, but high in northwest the Blue Mountains were still deep in snow. Ken came sliding down the low, crumbling bank about 50 yards down, and he was bringing the red blanket. Before they wrapped the old man, Leon took a piece of string out of his pocket and tied a small gray feather in the old man's long white hair. Ken gave him the paint. Across the brown, wrinkled forehead, he drew a streak of white, and along the high cheekbones he drew a strip of blue paint. He paused and watched Ken throw pinches of cornmeal and pollen into the wind that fluttered the small gray feather. Then Leon painted with yellow under the old man's broad nose. And finally, when he had painted green across the chin, he smiled. "Send us rain clouds, grandfather." They laid the bundle in the back of the pickup and covered it with a heavy tarp before they started back to the pueblo. They turned off the highway onto the sandy Pueblo road. Not long after they passed the store and post office, they saw Father Paul's car coming toward them. When he recognized their faces, he slowed his car and waved for them to stop. The young priest rolled down the car window. "Did you find old Teofilo?" he asked loudly. Leon stopped the truck. "Good morning, Father. We were just out to the sheep camp. Everything is okay now." "Thank God for that. Teofilo is a very old man. You really shouldn't allow him to stay at the sheep camp alone." "No, he won't do that anymore now." "Well, I'm glad you understand. I hope I'll be seeing you at Mass this week. We missed you last Sunday. See if you can get old Teofilo to come with you." The priest smiled and waved at them as they drove away. Louise and Teresa were waiting. The table was set for lunch, and the coffee was boiling on the black iron stove. Leon looked at Louise and then at Teresa. "We found him under a cottonwood tree in the big arroyo near sheep camp. I guess he sat down to rest in the shade and never got up again." Leon walked toward the old man's bed. The red plaid shawl had been shaken and spread carefully over the bed, and a new brown flannel shirt and pair of stiff new Levi's were arranged neatly beside the pillow. Louise held the screen door open while Leon and Ken carried in the red blanket. He looked small and shriveled, and after they dressed him in the new shirt and pants, he seemed more shrunken. It was noontime now because the church bells rang the Angelus. They ate the beans and hot bread, and nobody said anything until after Teresa poured the coffee. Ken stood up and put on his jacket. "I'll see about the grave diggers. Only the top layer of soil is frozen. I think it can be ready before dark." Leon nodded his head and finished his coffee. After Ken had been gone for a while, the neighbors and clanspeople came quietly to embrace Teofilo's family and to leave food on the table because the grave diggers would come to eat when they were finished. The sky in the west was full of pale yellow light. Louise stood outside with her hands in the pockets of Leon's green army jacket that was too big for her. The funeral was over, and the old men had taken their candles and medicine bags and were gone. She waited until the body was laid into the pickup before she said anything to Leon. She touched his arm, and he noticed that her hands were still dusty from the cornmeal that she had sprinkled around the old man. When she spoke, Leon could not hear her. "What did you say? I didn't hear you." "I said that I had been thinking about something." "About what?" "About the priest sprinkling holy water for Grandpa so he won't be thirsty." Leon stared at the new moccasins that Teofilo had made for the ceremonial dances in the summer. They were nearly hidden by the red blanket. It was getting colder and the wind pushed gray dust down the narrow Pueblo road. The sun was approaching the long mesa where it disappeared during the winter. Louise stood there shivering and watching his face. Then he zipped his jacket and opened the truck door. "I'll see if he's there." Ken stopped the pickup at the church, and Leon got out. And then Ken drove down the hill to the graveyard where people were waiting. Leon knocked at the old carved door with its symbols of the lamb. While he waited, he looked up at the twin bells from the King of Spain, with the last sunlight pouring around them in their tower. The priest opened the door and smiled when he saw who it was. "Come in. What brings you here this evening?" The priest walked toward the kitchen, and Leon stood with his cap in his hand, playing with the ear flaps and examining the living room, the brown sofa, the green armchair, and the brass lamp that hung down from the ceiling by links of chain. The priest dragged a chair out of the kitchen and offered it to Leon. "No, thank you, Father. I only came to ask you if you would bring holy water to the graveyard." The priest turned away from Leon and looked out the window at the patio full of shadows and the dining room windows of the nuns' cloister across the patio. The curtains were heavy, and the light from within faintly penetrated. It was impossible to see the nuns inside eating supper. "Why didn't you tell me he was dead? I could have brought the last rites anyway." Leon smiled. "It wasn't necessary, Father." The priest stared down at his scuffed brown loafers and the worn hem of his cassock. For a Christian burial, it was necessary. His voice was distant, and Leon thought that his blue eyes looked tired. "It's okay, Father. We just want him to have plenty of water." The priest sank down into the green chair and picked up a glossy missionary magazine. He turned the colored pages full of lepers and pagans without looking at them. "You know I can't do that, Leon. There should have been the last rites and a funeral mass at the very least." Leon put on his green cap and pulled the flaps down over his ears. "It's getting late, Father. I've got to go." When Leon opened the door, Father Paul stood up and said, "Wait." He left the room and came back wearing a long brown overcoat. He followed Leon out the door and across the dim churchyard to the adobe steps in front of the church. They both stooped to fit through the low adobe entrance. And when they started down the hill to the graveyard, only half of the sun was visible above the mesa. The priest approached the grave slowly, wondering how they managed to dig into the frozen ground. And then he remembered that this was New Mexico, and saw the pile of cold, loose sand beside the hole. The people stood close to each other with little clouds of steam puffing from their faces. The priest looked at them and saw a pile of jackets, gloves, and scarves in the yellow, dry tumbleweeds that grew in the graveyard. He looked at the red blanket, not sure that Teofilo was so small, wondering if it wasn't some perverse Indian trick, something they didn't march to ensure a good harvest, wondering if maybe old Teofilo was actually at sheep camp, corralling the sheep for the night. But there he was, facing into a cold, dry wind and squinting at the last sunlight, ready to bury a red wool blanket, while the faces of his parishioners were in shadow, with the last warmth of sun on their backs. His fingers were stiff, and it took him a long time to twist the lid off the holy water. Drops of water fell on the red blanket and soaked into dark, icy spots. He sprinkled the grave, and the water disappeared almost before it touched the dim, cold sand. It reminded him of something. He tried to remember what it was, because he thought if he could remember, he might understand this. He sprinkled more water. He shook the container until it was empty, and the water fell through the light from sundown, like August rain that fell while the sun was still shining, almost evaporating before it touched the wilted squash flowers. The wind pulled at the priest's brown Franciscan robe and swirled away the cornmeal and pollen that had been sprinkled on the blanket. They lowered the bundle into the ground, and they didn't bother to untie the stiff pieces of new rope that were tied around the ends of the blanket. The sun was gone, and over on the highway, the eastbound lane was full of headlights. The priest walked away slowly. Leon watched him climb the hill, and when he had disappeared within the tall, thick walls, Leon turned to look up at the high blue mountains in the deep snow that reflected a faint red light from the west. He felt good because it was finished, and he was happy about the sprinkling of the holy water. Now the old man could send them big thunderclouds for sure.
Okay, so let's turn now to the story, and let's pay attention to the really subtle, genius way that Leslie Marmon Silko is able to create tension within this story. Now, so much of that tension is, of course, rooted in cultural kinds of distinctions, and so we're going to be paying attention specifically to that. Notice right away the story opens with death, right? The old man under an old cottonwood tree. Notice the Levi jacket is mentioned right away, and we have Leon and Ken who are then going to find him. Immediately, as you read this story, you begin to try to figure out exactly what's going on in terms of the characters of the story. It's the second paragraph on 293. Watch it. Before they wrapped the old man, Leon took a piece of string out of his pocket and tied a small gray feather in the old man's long white hair. And it's at this moment that as you read the story, you start to go, there's something quite fascinating going on in this story. In other words, right away, we have cultural differences. Of course, in the story represented, we have two cultures. Let's write them down. One, obviously, we have the Native American culture. What do you do when the old man dies, right? So when Teofilo dies, how do you treat his body, right? Of course, number two, you have the Christian tradition, the Franciscan Catholic Christian tradition, and of course, when someone dies, there are rules in both cultures, right? Both cultures have their set of rules. Notice right away that one of those cultures is clearly going to take precedence over the other of those cultures. However, by the end of our story, the Christian culture of burial will play a significant role. So let's say it out loud. Clearly what Silko is doing for us is writing a story asking this question: how can two different cultures, sometimes conflicting cultures, cohabitate? How do they even get on together at all? We'll continue. You, of course, have the title represented by the third paragraph. Send us rain clouds, grandfather. Now, none of that makes much sense until you know that the setting of the story is New Mexico and the desert, and rain doesn't fall very often out there in that desert, right? And so, obviously, the hope of rain clouds will take us to the end, and the notion of holy water itself and all of that, right? Of course, They see Father Paul, who will play a role. By the way, point out for your notes at level 1, Father Paul is a young priest. In other words, he is going to be malleable, shapeable. And at the end of our story, he will make a decision which probably an older priest maybe would not have done. He is going to attend the funeral, and he's going to participate in the funeral, even though he's actually violating some of the Franciscan rules about how you're supposed to bury, right? Next, of course, we'll have the comment. Everything is okay now. Note the irony of that line. No, he's not going to be coming down there anymore. Obviously, we understand because it's ironic because, of course, he can't anymore because now he is dead. Notice the priest is going to say, I hope I see you at Mass. We missed you last Sunday. See if you can get old Trofilio. And that's, of course, going to be the first mention of the actual name of this old man to come with you. Let's put it in your notes. What's being said here brilliantly without it being actually said? Well, of course it is. Yeah, the old man, he doesn't have any affiliation with these Christian rituals at all. He is, of course, a part of his own native heritage. You then will have the second of the two characters on page 294 with Luis and Teresa, who are both waiting. Notice they continue with certain kinds of ceremonies. We have ceremonies already, and by the way, Leslie Marmon Silko has written a book called Ceremonies that I certainly recommend for you to read. Some brilliant, brilliant texts. But here we have the same, more of the ceremonies. What do you do when somebody dies? Well, the dressing in different clothes. Notice it's new Levi's. Point out as well for your notes how many times we're referencing how little this old man is. Shriveled, we might even say, with the words here, shriveled and shrunken. And then you got the church bells ringing out loud, and they're ready to do some kind of eating. You have the clans people. That word clans, of course, is an important word. And then the funeral over. Notice, that's the funeral, right? What they do with the old man there on his bed, that's what they constitute as the funeral. Now they're ready to go to the grave, right? And then they have this exchange between Leon and Luis back and forth. They will talk. What about the priest sprinkling holy